Please come out! Oh my God, he stabbed him! He ran toward the backyard, look!
Oh, my back.
Ma'am, stay with me. Is he still breathing?
Yes, but he's bleeding bad. Please hurry.
Can't feel my
Please
legs.
help him. He went through the fence. Please.
The air in the quiet neighborhood was suddenly filled with the sound of a woman's voice, sharp and full of terror. St. Cloud Police, please come out, she screamed into her phone, her words stumbling over each other in a race against time. She stood near the doorway, her face tight with a fear that only a mother could know. Inside, the normal sounds of a Tuesday afternoon had been replaced by the heavy thud of a struggle and the desperate gasps of someone in deep pain. "Where's the person with the knife?" she cried out, her eyes darting around the porch as if the attacker might jump out from the shadows at any moment. The world around her seemed to blur, the trees and houses of 12th Avenue North becoming nothing more than a backdrop to the nightmare unfolding in front of her. She pleaded with the dispatcher, her voice breaking as she begged for the officers to hurry. "I hope he's all right," she whispered, a small prayer offered up into the chaos. Every second felt like an hour, and every shadow looked like a threat as she waited for the sirens that would signal help had finally arrived. The call to 911 started with a voice that sounded like it was drowning in panic. Maura Beck's words were sharp and fast as she told the operator her address on 12th Avenue North. She couldn't stay still, her voice shaking as she explained that her son, Elias, was caught in a fight on the porch with someone who was trying to kill him. She cried out for the police to hurry, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. When the dispatcher asked who the attacker was, Maura could only say she didn't know, only that she had seen what looked like drugs on the porch just before the violence started. She described a terrifying scene where her son had suddenly yelled for her to call for help while he struggled with a man holding a knife. Every time the dispatcher tried to keep her calm, Maura's fear only grew. She screamed when she saw the red stains spreading across the porch, realizing there was blood everywhere. "Are you okay? Do you need an ambulance?" She shouted toward the porch, her voice filled with a desperate hope that someone would answer. The operator told her that officers were on their way, but to Maura, the wait felt like a lifetime while her son's life hung by a thread. The calm of the neighborhood was broken by the sharp sound of tires on pavement as the first police car pulled up to the 600 block of 12th Avenue North. The officer jumped out of his car, his bodycam tilting as he ran toward the house where the screaming was coming from. Everything felt fast and blurry. He saw Maura Beck standing near the entrance, her face pale as she pointed toward the porch. "St. Cloud Police, please come out." She was still crying out, her voice echoing off the nearby houses. The officer moved quickly, his hand near his belt, his eyes searching for the threat. As he reached the steps, the smell of iron and the sight of bright red stains on the wood told him how serious the situation was. He saw a man in a blue shirt slumped over, looking weak and in pain. Another man was there, too, his hands covered in blood as he tried to help. The officer's heart was racing, but he kept his voice steady as he began to take control of the chaos, asking who had the knife and where the attacker had gone. The quiet street had turned into a crime scene in a matter of seconds, and the air was thick with the feeling that every moment mattered. Inside the house, the light from the kitchen spilled onto the porch, showing the full extent of the tragedy. Elias Beck sat low against the wall, his face pale and covered in a cold sweat. The officer moved in close, his flashlight cutting through the dim air to find where the help was needed most. Maura stood nearby, her hand shaking as she pointed to the blood soaking through her son's blue shirt. "Where were you stabbed at?" the officer asked, his voice calm but firm to keep Elias focused. Elias could only manage a weak whisper, "In the back." When the officer gently moved the shirt, he saw deep wounds on Elias's back and buttock that were bleeding heavily. The officer knew he had to act fast, so he grabbed a clean towel to put pressure on the injuries. Every time Elias winced, Maura let out a small sob, her eyes wide with fear as she watched the officer work. The officer kept talking to Elias, telling him to stay awake and that the ambulance was almost there. Even though the situation looked very bad, they all held on to the hope that the doctors at the hospital could fix what had been broken in a single moment of anger. Outside the house, the night was dark and still, but the air felt heavy with the search for a brown pike. The officer on the porch quickly radioed the other units, giving them a description of the man who had just caused so much pain. "White male, wearing a blue camouflage hoodie," he said, his voice echoing through the quiet street. They knew Pike was on foot and couldn't have gone far, so the police began to circle the neighborhood, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Every alley and backyard became a place to check. The officers moved carefully, knowing that Pike might still have the knife or be hiding in the dark. Neighbors peered out of their windows, watching the red and blue lights flash against their walls, wondering how a quiet afternoon had turned into a manhunt. Grady O'Shea pointed toward the corner, telling the officers that Pike had scrambled away just after the fight. He almost looked knocked out, but then he just got up and ran, Grady explained, his voice full of disbelief. As the police dogs arrived to pick up a scent, the hunt for Pike became a race to catch him before he could disappear into the city for good. The officer moved away from the porch to talk to Grady O'Shea, who was sitting on the curb with his head in his hands. Grady's clothes were dirty from working on his bike, and his breath was heavy as he tried to calm down. "So, what happened?" the officer asked, clicking his pen as he prepared to write. Grady looked up, his eyes wide and honest. "Somebody tried killing my friend here," he said, pointing back toward the house. Grady explained that he had been outside all day and didn't think much of the two men being inside. He thought they were just tussling or having a small argument like friends sometimes do. But then, everything changed when he heard Elias scream for help. Grady ran to the door just as Elias and Abram Pike tumbled out onto the porch. That was when he saw the flash of the hunting knife. He wouldn't let go of Elias, Grady said, his voice shaking with the memory of the struggle. He told the officer how he had to make a split-second choice to jump into the middle of a fight to save his friend's life. The officer listened closely, knowing that Grady's words were the key to understanding why a normal day had ended in so much blood. The day had started out like any other normal Tuesday in St. Cloud. Grady O'Shea told the officer that he had been outside working on his bike since early in the afternoon. He saw Elias Beck and Abram Pike together, and to anyone watching, they looked like the best of friends. They spent the morning and afternoon doing yard work and listening to music while the sun was out. There was no sign of trouble and no angry words. Grady recalled that Pike had been at the house for hours, appearing to be just another guest hanging out in the warm weather. He had even left and come back at one point, and his bike was still parked outside as a sign that he was part of the group. Because they seemed so relaxed, Grady didn't feel the need to keep a close eye on them. He just kept working on his own projects, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the neighborhood. It was hard for Grady to understand how the same two men he saw laughing and working together earlier could end up in a fight that would change everything. The memory of that quiet morning now felt like a dream compared to the bloody reality of the night. Inside the house, the mood changed faster than the weather. While Grady was outside, the friendly music and yard work talk suddenly stopped. Maura Beck walked into the room and saw something that made her heart stop. Abram Pike was there, and it looked like there were drugs on the porch. Elias wasn't happy about it, and a loud argument broke out between the two men who had been hanging out all day. Suddenly, the tussling turned into something much more dangerous. Elias realized that his friend wasn't acting like a friend anymore. He saw Pike reach for something hidden, and before he could move away, a black hunting knife was pulled out. The sight of the long blade changed everything. Elias started yelling for his mother to call 911 because he knew he was in a fight for his life. On the porch, the space felt small and trapped. The air was filled with the sound of scuffling feet and angry shouts. Elias tried to defend himself, but Pike was determined, and the first strike of the knife landed, turning a simple disagreement into a deadly emergency. The peace of the day was gone, replaced by a terrifying fight for survival. Grady O'Shea reached the door just as Elias Beck and Abram Pike tumbled out of the house and onto the porch. Everything was moving too fast. Grady saw the flash of the black hunting knife and realized Pike was not letting go of Elias. Without thinking about his own safety, Grady jumped into the middle of the violence. He grabbed the knife by the blade side, trying to pull it away before it could do any more damage. The three men were locked together, spinning in a desperate circle on the small porch. It was a messy, clumsy struggle. Pike was strong and refused to give up the weapon, but Grady was determined to protect his friend. As they spun, Grady could hear Elias gasping and realized the situation was getting worse every second. He knew he had to do something big to break the circle and stop the attack before someone else got hurt. The struggle on the porch reached a breaking point. Grady O'Shea knew that as long as Abram Pike held that hunting knife, his friend Elias was in danger of being killed. Grady had his hands on the blade, but Pike was strong and refused to let go. They were locked in a dangerous dance, spinning near the door until Grady saw an opening. He didn't use a weapon, he used his own strength. Grady leaned in and delivered a powerful headbutt directly to Pike's face. The sudden, violent impact stunned Pike instantly. At the same time, Grady used a hip toss move, throwing his weight against Pike to slam him toward the ground. The combination of the headbutt and the hard fall worked. Pike's grip on the black hunting knife finally broke, and the weapon clattered onto the floorboards. Grady quickly grabbed the knife to make sure Pike couldn't use it again. For a brief second, it looked like the fight was over. Pike lay on the ground, seemingly knocked out from the blow to his head. Grady turned his attention back to Elias, thinking he had finally secured the scene and saved his friend's life. Grady O'Shea stood over Abram Pike, chest heaving, believing the danger had finally passed. Pike lay motionless on the ground after the hard hip toss and the headbutt. Grady looked at the hunting knife in his hand and then at his friend, Elias, who was bleeding badly on the porch. In that split second, Grady made a choice. He thought Pike was knocked out and decided to focus entirely on saving Elias. He rushed back to the porch to hand the knife to Elias, thinking his friend might need it to defend himself just in case Pike woke up. But as soon as Grady turned his back to help Elias and apply pressure to the wounds, the unthinkable happened. Pike wasn't as hurt as he seemed. He scrambled to his feet with surprising speed, his knocked-out state vanishing in an instant. By the time Grady turned back around, Pike was already running away into the darkness of the neighborhood. Grady felt a wave of disbelief. He had won the fight, but his decision to prioritize medical help over securing the attacker allowed the killer to escape into the night. The night air was filled with the sounds of a massive search as more police cars arrived on 12th Avenue North. Officers quickly set up a perimeter, blocking off the streets to make sure Abram Pike could not slip away. The bright flashlights of the police cut through the dark backyards and alleys as they searched for any sign of the man in the blue camouflage hoodie. "We got a perimeter set up. We'll check it out," one officer said over the radio, while others moved toward the north where Pike was last seen running. Soon, the sound of barking filled the air as the K-9 units arrived. The police dogs were brought to the porch to pick up Pike's scent from the struggle. Officers walked with the dogs through the shadows, checking behind dumpsters and under porches. Everyone was on high alert, knowing that a dangerous man was hiding somewhere in the dark. Inside the police cars, the radios crackled with updates as units moved block by block, determined to find Pike before the sun came up. The ambulance sped through the streets of St. Cloud, sirens screaming as paramedics worked desperately to keep Shane Bruner alive. Inside the emergency room, the quiet night was replaced by the frantic energy of doctors and nurses. Shane was rushed straight into surgery to stop the internal bleeding caused by the deep wounds to his back and buttock. The surgical team worked for hours under bright lights, trying to repair the damage done by the hunting knife. Back at the hospital waiting room, the air was thick with a heavy silence. Maura Beck sat in a hard chair, her eyes fixed on the doors, waiting for any word from the doctors. She remembered the peaceful morning listening to music and couldn't believe her son was now fighting for every breath. Despite the best efforts of the medical team and every modern tool they had, the damage to Shane's body was too great. As the sun began to rise the next morning, the doctors had to deliver the news that no mother ever wants to hear. Resuscitation had failed, and Shane Bruner was gone. While the police were searching for Abram Pike, investigators were busy looking for clues at the house. They found a home security camera that had captured the entire fight on the porch. By watching the surveillance footage and talking to Maura and Grady, they were able to confirm that the suspect was 25-year-old Marquis Jacob Pfizer. The video showed that Pfizer had been at the house for hours and was treated like a guest before the sudden attack. The investigators also looked into why the fight started. They found illegal drugs at the scene, which Maura had mentioned when she first called 911. Later, a medical report called a toxicology test showed that Shane Bruner had controlled substances in his body when he arrived at the hospital. This helped the police understand that the tussling between the friends might have been fueled by drugs. These pieces of evidence, the video and the drug reports, allowed the police to build a strong case against Pfizer, proving he was the one who used the knife. The massive search for the man in the blue camouflage hoodie finally came to an end the day after the stabbing. Through a coordinated effort, police tracked Marquis Jacob Pfizer and took him into custody. The neighborhood, which had been filled with police dogs and flashing lights just hours before, began to feel a sense of relief. Pfizer was no longer hiding in the shadows of St. Cloud. He was now behind bars, facing the consequences of the violence on the porch. Investigators worked quickly to process him, matching his appearance to the descriptions given by Grady and the images found on the home surveillance cameras. While Pfizer was being locked in a cell, the reality of the situation began to sink in for everyone involved. The man who had been a friend, hanging out and listening to music just a day earlier, was now the primary suspect in a murder case. With the arrest complete, the focus of the story shifted from the hunt on the streets to the long road of justice in the courtroom. The case of Marquis Jacob Pfizer finally made its way into the courtroom, where a jury had to decide what really happened on that porch. Prosecutors charged him with second-degree intentional murder, arguing that he meant to kill his friend. However, as the trial went on, the jury looked closely at all the evidence, including the drug reports and the stories about their friendship. They had to decide if Pfizer had planned the attack or if it was a sudden explosion of violence. In the end, the jury reached a complicated decision. They acquitted Pfizer of intentional murder, meaning they didn't believe he specifically set out that day to take a life. But they did not let him go free. They found him guilty of second-degree murder and second-degree assault with a dangerous weapon. While their intent was not proven to their satisfaction, the reality of the bloody hunting knife and Shane Bruner's death could not be ignored. The verdict brought a heavy end to the legal battle, proving that even among friends, violent actions carry a permanent cost. The judge looked down at Marquis Jacob Pfizer as the final sentence was read out in the quiet courtroom. For the second-degree murder of Shane Bruner, Pfizer was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The room was still, filled with the heavy weight of a life lost and a friendship that ended in the worst way possible. As Pfizer was led away in handcuffs, the reality of the timeline set in. Under the Minnesota sentencing rules, he would not be eligible to even ask for parole until July 2038. By the time Pfizer is eligible to leave prison, over a decade will have passed since that bloody afternoon on 12th Avenue North. For Grady O'Shea and Maura Beck, the scars of that day will never fully fade. They are left with the memories of a morning spent doing yard work and listening to music, a peaceful scene that was destroyed by a hunting knife and a series of bad choices. The story of Shane Bruner serves as a tragic reminder of how quickly hanging out can turn into a life-and-death struggle. While the legal case is now closed, the impact of that day continues for everyone who was standing on the porch when the spinning circle finally stopped.